Notable annotations. The English translation of some of the more important annotations of the successes was done by an early biographer of Rizal, Austin Craig, from 1872 to 1949. So who is Austin Craig? Governor Antonio D. Morga was not only the first to write but also the first to publish a Philippine history. This statement has regard to the concise and concrete form in which our author has treated the matter. Father Quirino's work, printed at Rome in 1604, is rather a chronicle of the missions than a history of the Philippines. Still, it contains a great deal of the valuable material of usage and customs. The worthy Jesuit in fact admits that he abandoned writing a political history because Morga had already done so. So one must infer that he had seen the work in manuscript before leaving the islands. By the Christian religion, Dr. Morga appears to mean the Roman Catholic, which by fire and sword he would preserve in its purity in the Philippines. Nevertheless, in other lands, notably in Flanders, these means were ineffective to keep the church unchanged or to maintain its supremacy, or even to hold its subjects. Great kingdoms were indeed discovered and conquered in the remote and unknown parts of the world by Spanish ships, but to the Spaniards who sailed in them we may add Portuguese, Italians, French, Greeks, and even Africans and Polynesians. The expeditions captained by Columbus and Magellan, one a Genoese Italian and the other Portuguese, as well as those that came after them, although Spanish fleets still were manned by many nationalities and in them went Negros, Moluccans, even in men from the Philippines and the Marian Islands. 3 centuries ago, it was the custom to write as intolerantly as Morga does, but nowadays it would be called a bit presumptuous. No one has a monopoly of a true God, nor is there any nation or religion that can claim, or at any rate that prove, that to it has been given the exclusive right to the Creator of all things or sole knowledge of His real being. The conversions by the Spaniards were not as general as their historians claim. The missionaries only succeeded in a converting part of the people of the Philippines. Still, there are Mohammedans, the Moros in the southern islands, and the Negritos, Igorots, and other heathens yet occupy the greater part territorially of the archipelago. Then, the islands which the Spaniards early held but soon lost are non-Christian Formosa, Borneo, and the Moluccas. And if there are Christians in the Carolines, that is due to Protestants whom neither the Roman Catholics of the Morga's day nor many Catholics in our own day consider Christians. It is not the fact that the Filipinos were unprotected before the coming of the Spaniards. Morga himself says further on in telling the pirate raids from the south that previous to the Spanish domination the islands had arms and defended themselves, but after the natives were disarmed, the pirates pillaged them with impunity, coming at times when they were unprotected by the government, which was the reason for many of the insurrections. The civilization of the pre-Spanish Filipinos in regard to the duties of life for that age was well advanced, as the Morga history shows in its 8th chapter. The islands came under Spanish sovereignty and control through compacts, treaties of friendship, and alliances for reciprocity. By virtue for the last arrangement, according to some historians, Magellan lost his life on Mactan and the soldiers of Legazpi fought under the banner of King Tupas of Cebu.
The term, conquest, is admissible but for a part of the islands and then only in its broadest sense. Cebu, Panay, Luzon, Mindoro and some others cannot be said to have been conquered. The discovery, conquest and conversion cost Spanish blood but still more Filipino blood. It will be seen later on in Morga that with the Spaniards and on behalf of Spain there were always more Filipinos fighting than Spaniards. Morga shows that the ancient Filipinos had army and navy with artillery and other implements of warfare. Their prized prizes and campulans for their magnificent temper are worthy of admiration and some of them are richly damascened. Their coats of mail and helmets, of which there are specimens in various European museums, attest their great advancement in this industry. Morga's expression that the Spaniards brought war to the gates of the Filipinos is in marked contrast with the word used by subsequent historians whenever recording Spain's possessing herself of a province, that she pacified it. Perhaps, to make peace, then meant the same as, to stir up war. This is a veiled allusion to the old Latin saying of Romans, often quoted by Spaniards, that they made a desert, calling it making peace. Austin Craig. Magellan's transferring from the service of his own king to employment under the King of Spain, according to historic documents, was because the Portuguese king had refused to grant him the raise in salary which he asked. Now it is known that Magellan was mistaken when he represented to the King of Spain that the Molucca Islands were within the limits assigned by the Pope to the Spaniards. But through this error and the inaccuracy of the nautical instruments of that time, the Philippines did not fall into the hands of the Portuguese. Cebu, which Morga calls the city of the most holy name of Jesus, was at first called the village of San Miguel. The image of the Holy Child of Cebu, which many religious writers believed was brought to Cebu by the angels, was in fact given by the worthy Italian chronicler of Magellan's expedition, the Chevalier Pigafetta, to the Cebuano queen. The expedition of Villalobos, intermediate between Magellan's and Legazpi's, gave the name, Filipina, to one of the southern islands, Tendaya, now perhaps Leyte, and this name later was extended to the whole archipelago. Of the native Manila rulers the coming of the Spaniards, Raja Solomon was called Rang Mura, or Young King, in distinction from the old king, Rang Matanda. Historians have confused these personages. The native fort at the mouth of the Pasig River, which Morga speaks of as equipped with brass lantakas and artillery of larger caliber, had its ramparts reinforced with thick hardwood posts such as the Tagalogs used for their houses and called harigs, or halagui. Morga has evidently confused the Pacific coming of Legazpi with the attack of Goiti and Salcedo, as to date. According to other historians, it was in 1570 that Manila was burned, and with it a great plant for manufacturing artillery. Goiti did not take possession of the city but withdrew to Cavite and afterwards to Panay, which makes one suspicious of his alleged victory. As to the day of the date, the Spaniards then, having come following the course of the sun, were some 16 hours later than Europe. This condition continued till the end of the year 1844, when the 31st of December was by special arrangement among the authorities dropped from the calendar for that year. Accordingly, Legazpi did not arrive in Manila on the 19th but on the 20th of May, and consequently it was not on the festival of Santa Potenciana but on San Basilio's Day. The same mistake was made with reference to the other early events still wrongly commemorated, like San Andres Day for the repulse of the Chinese corsair Li Ma Hong. Though not mentioned by Morga, the Cebuano aided the Spaniards in their expedition against Manila, for which reason they were long exempted from tribute. The southern islands, the Visayas, were also called the land of the painted people, or pintados, in Spanish because the natives had their bodies decorated with tracings made with fire, somewhat like tattooing. The Spaniards retained the native name for the new capital of the archipelago, a little changed, however, for the Tagalogs had called their city, Manila. When Morga says that the lands were entrusted, given as encomiendas, to those who had pacified them, he means divided up among. The word entrust, like pacify, later came to have a sort of ironical signification. To entrust a province was then as if it were said that it was turned over to sack, abandoned to the cruelty and covetousness of the encomendero, to judge from the way these gentry misbehaved. Legazpi's grandson, Salcedo, called the Hernando Cortez of the Philippines, was the conqueror's intelligent right arm and the hero of the conquest. His honesty and fine qualities, talent and personal bravery, all won the admiration of the Filipinos. Because of him they yielded to their enemies, making peace and friendship with the Spaniards. He it was who saved Manila from Li Ma Hong. He died at the early age of 27 and is the only encomendero recorded to have left the great part of his possessions to the Indians of his encomienda. Vigan was his encomienda and the Lacanos there were his heirs. The expedition which followed the Chinese corsair Li Ma Hong, after his unsuccessful attack upon Manila, to Pangasinan province, with the Spaniards of whom Morga tells, had in it 1,500 friendly Indians from Cebu, Bohol, Leyte and Panay, besides the many others serving as laborers and crews of the ships. Former Raja Lacandola, of Tondo, with his sons and his kinsmen went, too, with 200 more Bisayans, and they were joined by other Filipinos in Pangasinan. Captain Gabriel de Rivera, a Spanish commander who had gained fame in a raid on Borneo and the Malacca coast, was the first envoy from the Philippines to take up with the King of Spain the needs of the archipelago. The early conspiracy of the Manila and Pampangan former chiefs was revealed to the Spaniards by a Filipina, the wife of a soldier, and many concerned lost their lives. The artillery cast for the new stone fort in Manila, says Morga, was by the hand of an ancient Filipino. That is, he knew how to cast cannon even before the coming of the Spaniards, hence he was distinguished as 4 inches ancient. In this difficult art of ironworking, as in so many others, the modern or present-day Filipinos are not so far advanced as were their ancestors. When the English freebooter Cavendish captured the Mexican galleon Santa Ana, with 122,000 gold pesos, a great quantity of rich textile silks, satins and damask, musk perfume, and stores of provisions, he took 150 prisoners. All these because of their brave defense were put ashore with ample supplies, except 2 Japanese lads, 3 Filipinos, a Portuguese and a skilled Spanish pilot whom he kept as guides in his further voyaging. From the earliest Spanish days ships were built in the islands, which might be considered evidence of native culture. Nowadays this industry is reduced to small craft. Scows and coasters. The Jesuit, Father Alonso Sanchez, who visited the papal court at Rome and the Spanish king at Madrid, had a mission much like that of deputies now, but of even greater importance since he came to be a sort of counselor or representative to the absolute monarch of that epoch. One wonders why the Philippines could have a representative then but may not have one now. A stone house for the bishop was built before starting on the governor-general's residence. This precedence is interesting for those who uphold the civil power. Morga's mention of the scant output of large artillery from the Manila cannon works because of lack of master foundry men shows that after the death of the Filipino Panday Pira there were not Spaniards skilled enough to take his place, nor were his sons as expert as he. The historian Argensola, in telling of 4 special galleys for Dasmariñas expedition, says that they were manned by an expedient which was generally considered rather harsh. It was ordered that there be bought enough of the Indians who were slaves of the former Indian chiefs, or principales, to form these crews, and the price, that which had been customary in pre-Spanish times, was to be advanced by the encomenderos who later would be reimbursed from the royal treasury. In spite of this promised compensation, the measures still seemed severe since those Filipinos were not correct in calling their dependents slaves. Morga says that the 250 Chinese oarsmen who manned Governor Dasmariñas' swift galley were under pay and had the special favor of not being chained to their benches. According to Hum, it was covetousness of the wealth aboard that led them to revolt and kill the governor. But the historian Gaspar de San Agustin states that the reason for the revolt was the governor's abusive language and his threatening the rowers. Both these authors' allegations may have contributed, but more important was the fact that there was no law to compel these Chinamen to row in the galleys. They had come to Manila to engage in commerce or to work in trades or to follow professions. Still, the incident contradicts the reputation for enduring everything which they have had. The Filipinos have been much more long-suffering than the Chinese since, in spite of having been obliged to row on more than one occasion, they never mutinied. It is difficult to excuse the missionaries' disregard of the laws of nations and the usages of honorable politics in their interference in Cambodia on the ground that it was to spread the faith. Religion had a broad field awaiting it then in the Philippines where more than 9/10 of the natives were infidels. That even now there are to be found here so many tribes and settlements of non-Christians takes away much of the prestige of that religious zeal which in the easy life in towns of wealth, liberal and fond of display, grows lethargic. Truth is that the ancient activity was scarcely for the faith alone, because the missionaries had to go to islands rich in spices and gold, though there were at hand Mohammedans and Jews in Spain and Africa, Indians by the million in the Americas, and more millions of Protestants, schismatics and heretics peopled, and still people, over 6/7 of Europe. All of these doubtless would have accepted the light and the true religion if the friars, under pretext of preaching to them, had not abused their hospitality and if behind the name religion had not lurked the unnamed domination. In the attempt made by Rodriguez de Figueroa to conquer Mindanao according to his contract with the King of Spain, there was fighting along the Rio Grande with the people called the Buhahayans. Their general, according to Argensola, was the celebrated Silonga, later distinguished for many deeds in raids on the Visayas and adjacent islands. Chirino relates an anecdote of his coolness under fire once during a truce for a marriage among Mindanao, Principalia. Young Spaniards out of bravado fired at his feet but he passed on as if unconscious of the bullets. That the Spaniards used the word discover very carelessly may be seen from an admiral's turning in a report of his discovery of the Solomon Islands, though he noted that the islands had been discovered before. Death has always been the first sign of European civilization on its introduction in the Pacific Ocean. God grant that it may not be the last, though to judge by statistics the civilized islands are losing their populations at a terrible rate. Magellan himself inaugurated his arrival in the Marianas Islands by burning more than 40 houses, many small craft and 7 people because one of his boats had been stolen. Yet to the simple savages the act had nothing wrong in it but was done with the same naturalness that civilized people hunt, fish, and subjugate people that are weak or ill-armed. Still the Spaniards say that the Filipinos have contributed nothing to Mother Spain, and that it is the islands which owe everything. It may be so, but what about the enormous sum of gold which was taken from the islands in the early years of Spanish rule? Of the tributes collected by the encomenderos, of the $9 million yearly collected to pay the military expenses of the employees, diplomatic agents, corporations and the like, charged to the Philippines, with salaries paid out of the Philippine treasury not only for those who come to the Philippines but also for those who leave, to some who never have been and never will be in the islands, as well as to others who have nothing to do with them. While Japan was preparing to invade the Philippines, these islands were sending expeditions to Tonquin and Cambodia, leaving the homeland helpless even against the undisciplined hordes from the south, so obsessed were the Spaniards with the idea of making conquests. In Morga's time, the Philippines exported silk to Japan, whence now comes the best quality of that merchandise. Morga's views upon the failure of Governor Pedro de Acuña's ambitious expedition against the Moros unhappily still apply, for the same conditions yet exist. For fear of uprisings and loss of Spain's sovereignty over the islands, the inhabitants were disarmed, leaving them exposed to the harassing of a powerful and dreaded enemy. Even now, Though the use of steam vessels has put an end to piracy from outside, the same fatal system still is followed. Hernando de los Rios blames these Moluccan wars for the fact that at first the Philippines were a source of expense to Spain instead of profitable in spite of the tremendous sacrifices of the Filipinos. Their practically gratuitous labor in building and equipping the galleons, and despite, too, the tribute, tariffs and other imposts and monopolies. These wars to gain the Moluccas, which soon were lost forever with the little that had been so laboriously obtained, were a heavy drain upon the Philippines. They depopulated the country and bankrupted the treasury, with not the slightest compensating benefit. True also is it that it was to gain the Moluccas that Spain kept the Philippines, the desire for the rich Spice Islands being one of the most powerful arguments when, because of their expense to him, the king thought of withdrawing and abandoning them. Among the Filipinos who aided the government when the Manila Chinese revolted, Argensola says there were 4,000 Pampangans, armed after the way of their land, with bows and arrows, short lances, shields, and broad and long daggers. Some Spanish writers say that the Japanese volunteers and the Filipinos showed themselves cruel in slaughtering the Chinese refugees. This may very well have been so, considering the hatred and rancor then existing, but those in command set the example. The Cebuanos drew a pattern on the skin before starting into tattoo. The Bisayan usage then was the same procedure that the Japanese today follow. Ancient traditions ascribe the origin of the Malay Filipinos to the island of Sumatra. These traditions were almost completely lost as well as the mythology and the genealogies of which the early historians tell, thanks to the zeal of the missionaries in eradicating all national remembrances as heathen or idolatrous. The study of ethnology is restoring this somewhat. Consequently, in this respect, the pacifiers introduced no moral improvement. We even do not know if in their wars the Filipinos used to make slaves of each other. Though that would not have been strange, for the chroniclers tell of captives returned to their own people. The practice of the southern pirates almost proves this, although in these piratical wars the Spaniards were the first aggressors and gave them their character. Rizal's arguments of Morga's Sucesos. Three main propositions were emphasized in Rizal's new edition of Morga's Sucesos. 1. The people of the Philippines had a culture on their own, even before the coming of the Spaniards. 2. Filipinos were decimated, demoralized, exploited, and ruined by the Spanish colonization. And 3. The present state of the Philippines was not necessarily superior to its past. In Rizal's historical essay, he correctly observed that as a colony of Spain, the Philippines was depopulated, impoverished and retarded, astounded by metaphor cis, with no confidence in her past, still without faith in her present and without faltering hope in the future. He went to say, little by little, they Filipinos lost their old traditions, the mementos of their past. They gave up their writing, their songs, their poems, their laws, in order to learn other doctrines which they did not understand, another morality, another aesthetics, different from those inspired by their climate and their manner of thinking. They declined, degrading themselves in their own eyes, they become ashamed of what was their own. They began to admire and praise whatever was foreign and incomprehensible, their spirit was damaged and it surrendered. Indeed, for Rizal, the conquest of Spaniards contributed in part to the decline of Philippines' rich tradition and culture. Thank you.